The village hall of Little Garth, nestled between the patchwork fields of Lincolnshire and the slow-curling Thames tributary, was a place that seldom stirred more than a polite yawn. It was the sort of building whose architecture suggested a committee's compromise, a brick facade awkwardly married to an ill-judged Victorian porch, and whose only excitement usually involved the annual flower show or the monthly town council meeting, both events being modestly well attended by a mixture of retired teachers, puzzled farmers, and the odd vicar with a penchant for gin. This particular Tuesday, as the clock chimed 2, the hall was quietly buzzing with the polite murmurs of the town's assorted dignitaries and society ladies gathered for what was officially billed as the Little Garth Horticultural Society's afternoon tea and discussion. The subject on the agenda was as gripping as one might expect, the choice of dahlias for next summer's show and the vexing problem of persistent slugs in Mr. Beasley's prize chrysanthemums. Inspector Purbright, sitting unobtrusively by the window, observed the proceedings with mild interest. His trench coat was draped over the back of a folding chair, his notepad rested untouched, and his spectacles caught the low afternoon sun as he sipped a cup of Earl Grey. Purbright's expression was one of polite attention, but his eyes scanned the room, noting the minute exchanges of glances and the barely perceptible tightening of lips, the subtle signs of local social dynamics at work. Near the tea table stood Mrs. Agnes Hawthorne, the widow of the late George Hawthorne, a man of some repute in Little Garth for his obstinate devotion to both his garden and his annual poker nights. Mrs. Hawthorne was a slight woman, with silver hair pinned tightly at the nape and a habit of speaking in tones just above a whisper. She was carefully pouring tea into delicate china cups with a precision that suggested ritual rather than casual hospitality. At exactly 2:15 p.m., a peculiar event interrupted the otherwise predictable hum of polite conversation. Mrs. Hawthorne, having served the last cup, suddenly stiffened. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. The room's chatter faltered as eyes turned toward her, drawn by a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft, continuous tapping, like a slow heartbeat, emanating from the rear of the hall. Following the collective gaze, a young council clerk, Miss Poppy Clark, approached the curtained partition that divided the main room from the small storage area behind. She hesitated, then drew back the curtain. Inside was a scene that halted breath and froze the afternoon. Mr. George Hawthorne, sitting upright in an armchair, still dressed in his gardening tweeds, a cup of tea cradled in his hand, yet unmistakably dead. His eyes were fixed open, as if startled by the conversation he was missing, his mouth frozen mid-curve, as if just about to say something, or perhaps protest the very tea being served to him. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old hall clock and the faint drip of a leaking tap somewhere in the kitchen. Mrs. Hawthorne stood frozen by the doorway, her pale face as composed as if the grim tableau were merely an inconvenient detail of the afternoon. Inspector Purbright rose quietly from his seat, folding his hands as he approached the scene with the unruffled patience of a man who knew that in Little Garth every crime was, above all, a matter of waiting and listening. The widow's whispered explanation came softly, almost rehearsed. He was to have his tea before the council meeting. He said he'd rest for a moment. And then, well, I served him. I never thought he'd... There was no hysteria, no shriek, only a careful, courteous understatement that was somehow more chilling. As the small crowd murmured and the first faint stirrings of gossip began, Purbright made a note in his book. The game had begun as quietly and as subtly as a dahlia blooming in the shadow of slugs. The news of George Hawthorne's death spread through Little Garth with the quiet inevitability of a summer fog rolling over the fenlands. By early evening, the village pub, the creaking door, was thrumming with subdued whispers and sideways glances. The patrons gathered in small knots, each bringing to the conversation their own seasoning of fact, supposition, and the inevitable embellishments that small-town life demands. Mrs. Hawthorne's composure became the subject of much debate. "Too calm for a grieving widow," muttered Mr. Billings, the local baker, to no one in particular, nursing a pint of mildly sour ale. "Served him tea after he was dead, they say. Some say that's downright eerie." His companion, Mrs. Whittaker, whose curiosity was only exceeded by her penchant for dramatics, added, "Or maybe she was trying to keep appearances. You never know what goes on behind closed doors." Over by the dartboard, the village council's chairman, Mr. Percival, spoke in clipped tones to the vicar, his voice low but firm. An unfortunate incident, no doubt, but the timing just before the meeting couldn't be worse for the council's image. "We must ensure things don't get out of hand. It's best handled quietly." The vicar, Reverend Collins, adjusted his collar and nodded. "Indeed, the last thing we need is scandal. I trust the inspector will be thorough but discreet." Meanwhile, in the village shop, the news had already reached Mrs. Tiller, whose gossip was as reliable as the Morning Post. She remarked to a passing customer, "I always thought George had his faults." Stubborn old coot, always complaining about the council. There was talk of a row with the new housing development plans. Could be that stirred up some ill feeling. Back in the hall, Purbright lingered near the doorway, observing the various townsfolk as they filed past. The scene, each trying to appear casual, but betraying small tells, a tightened jaw, averted eyes, the way a hand hovered nervously over a pocket watch. The inspector made no haste to question anyone just yet. Instead, he allowed the undercurrents of the village's subtle social dance to emerge naturally. As evening fell, Purbright finally found a moment with Mrs. Hawthorne in the quiet parlour adjacent to the hall. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice measured, almost rehearsed, as she recounted the afternoon's events. "George was feeling unwell, you see. Said he needed to rest before the council meeting. I brought his tea as usual. When I returned, he was, as you saw." Her eyes flicked briefly away, then back, steady and unblinking. Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Did he complain of anything unusual? Any quarrels this morning? Perhaps something troubling him?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," she replied, "though he did seem distracted. Mentioned the council's new plans again. He wasn't happy about them." The inspector made a mental note of the council and its factions. The seemingly mundane disagreements over local policy might hide a sharper edge. As he left the room, he caught the faintest scent of lavender, mingled with something less definable, a hint of something metallic, perhaps the residue of recent handling. Outside, the night deepened, and little Garth settled uneasily into its shadows. The surface calm belied the tensions slowly simmering beneath. Inspector Purbright understood that in a place like this, death was rarely a simple matter, and the truth often whispered from behind layers of civility and small resentments. He pocketed his notebook and prepared for the delicate task ahead, untangling the threads of a quiet tragedy in a village that prided itself on its appearances. By the following morning, little Garth was quietly abuzz once more, though now with an added layer of wary speculation. The Morning Post, delivered with the usual punctuality by young Tommy Beckett, seemed to carry heavier news than mere bills and garden club flyers. At the village cafe, the Green Kettle, early patrons clustered around their tea and toast, voices lowered yet brimming with curious urgency. Inspector Purbright arrived just as the sun filtered weakly through the thinning clouds. His gait was unhurried, his expression a careful mask of professional calm. The quiet clatter of cups and the faint hum of conversation greeted him as he entered. Mrs. Humphreys, the cafe owner and unofficial town archivist, greeted him with a curt nod. "Morning, Inspector," the usual. "Thank you, Mrs. Humphreys, yes, and if you have a moment, I'd appreciate your company." As the steaming cup was set before him, Purbright began his deliberate inquiries. His first visit was to the village council offices, a modest building tucked between the post office and the butcher's shop. There he spoke with Mr. Percival, the chairman, a man whose neat tie and impeccable manners belied a restlessness barely concealed behind his spectacles. "Inspector," Percival began, "we're all quite shocked by this tragedy. George was, a fixture in this town, but I must say his opposition to the new housing plans was rather vigorous." "Yes, I have been made aware," Purbright said, his tone even. "Might I ask, did Mr. Hawthorne express any specific concerns or threats related to those plans?" Percival hesitated. "He voiced his objections loudly at council meetings, yes, but threats, none that I'm aware of." Next, Purbright sought out Miss Poppy Clark, the young council clerk, who had been first to discover the body. In the cool light of her cramped office, Purbright noted her nervous fidgeting and quick, uncertain glances. "Miss Clark, may I ask about yesterday afternoon? You were the one who found Mr. Hawthorne?" "Yes, sir," she replied softly. I was just tidying up when I heard a noise behind the curtain. I thought it might be the janitor, but then—" Her voice trailed off, and Purbright refrained from pressing too hard. Instead, he gently asked, "Did you notice anything unusual before or after?" She shook her head. "Nothing, really. Except, well, Mrs. Hawthorne was very calm. Too calm, some said. But I only spoke to her briefly." The inspector made a discreet note. Throughout the day, Purbright's inquiries continued in the measured manner that had become his hallmark. He spoke with the vicar, Reverend Collins, who admitted quietly to sensing a strain beneath the village's surface, but insisted on the importance of maintaining the peace. The butcher, Mr. Hargreaves, hinted at whispered quarrels between George Hawthorne and a local developer, but added little detail. Each conversation layered more texture onto the subtle portrait of Little Garth's social fabric. Petty rivalries, hidden grievances, and carefully guarded resentments began to emerge, all painted in muted shades rather than bold strokes. By late afternoon, Purbright sat again by the window of the Green Kettle, his mind sifting through the fragments. The widow's composure, the council's tensions, the nervous clerk, all threads waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. Yet the picture remained elusive, as if the town itself were holding its breath, reluctant to unveil its secrets. As dusk approached, Purbright rose, tucking his notebook away. There was much still to learn, and patience, as ever, was his most valuable tool. The morning sun cast pale light over Little Garth, yet the village seemed weighed down by an uneasy stillness. News of George Hawthorne's death had settled into a grim undercurrent, and the talk of the town had taken a sharper edge. At the heart of it all was a figure who had, until recently, been little more than a background presence in the village's gentle theatrics, Mr. Reginald Stubbs, the ambitious local developer. Stubbs had arrived in Little Garth some 5 years prior, a man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed moustache and an unshakable smile. His plans to modernize parts of the village, including the contentious proposal for new housing on the common land, had made him a target of quiet hostility, most notably from George Hawthorne. As Inspector Purbright made his way to Stubbs's office, a modest brick building with a freshly painted sign, he noticed how the villagers' eyes seemed drawn toward the place with a mixture of suspicion and grudging acceptance. Stubbs greeted Purbright with the polished charm of a man accustomed to smoothing over conflicts. Inspector, I'm very sorry to hear about Mr. Hawthorne. Quite the loss for the community. Thank you, Mr. Stubbs, Purbright replied, his tone neutral. I understand you and Mr. Hawthorne had differing views on the housing plans. Stubbs sighed, glancing briefly out the window. Yes, George was steadfast in his opposition. I won't deny there were some heated exchanges at council meetings, but I never wished him harm. Quite the contrary. I hoped to find some middle ground. Can you account for your whereabouts yesterday afternoon? Stubbs's smile tightened. At the club, as usual. Several witnesses can confirm. We had a lively discussion on the merits of urban development. Purbright nodded slowly. And your relationship with Mrs. Hawthorne? Any tensions there? Stubbs hesitated, then shook his head. Only the usual polite exchanges. Agnes is a dignified lady. That evening, as Purbright returned through the village, he overheard fragments of conversation. Stubbs had the motive, no doubt, said one voice, but he was out of town when George passed. Another whispered, still business can be a cruel game. Yet a detail caught Purbright's eye, almost imperceptible. A single garden glove discarded by the roadside, slightly damp, its fingers curled as if hastily removed. He pocketed it carefully, filing the image away. The inspector's mind was working steadily beneath the surface. Stubbs was a convenient suspect, yes, but something about the calm precision of the widow's demeanour, the quiet undercurrents in the council, and now this trivial glove, suggested a more intricate tapestry. As night fell, Purbright sat in his study, reviewing notes and observations. The neat narrative of an angry developer was unravelling, replaced by a web of subtle rivalries and unspoken grievances. The game was far from over. The following morning dawned grey and damp, the kind of weather that seemed to encourage introspection rather than action. Little Garth was wrapped in a mist that blurred the edges of its tidy cottages and trimmed hedgerows, as if the village itself were trying to keep some secrets hidden from the prying eyes of the world. Inspector Purbright found himself drawn back to the scene of the quiet tragedy. The village hall, where a curious detail had nagged at him ever since he first noticed it. Amid the ordered rows of chairs and the polished surfaces of the tea table, there had been, quite incongruously, a single misplaced object, a small, chipped porcelain saucer lying askew beneath the sideboard. On closer examination, the saucer bore a faint smudge of something dark, nearly imperceptible to the casual observer. Purbright's trained eye detected the subtle gloss of dried liquid, not tea, not the usual stains one might expect, but something altogether more sinister. He had asked Mrs. Hawthorne about it, but she had dismissed the inquiry with her usual calm. The children sometimes play in the hall after meetings, she had said softly. They're careless, I'm afraid. Yet the saucer had not belonged to any of the village's common crockery sets. It was part of a delicate service, one that Mrs. Hawthorne kept locked away, reserved for special occasions. Its presence here, in this haphazard position, struck Purbright as odd, almost deliberate. Further investigation revealed that the smudge was a faint trace of a substance often used in horticulture, specifically a potent pesticide known to be both toxic and fast-acting. The kind of chemical a gardener might handle with care, yet deadly if misused. The inspector considered the implications. George Hawthorne, a man known for his devotion to his garden, would have been intimately familiar with such substances. Could the presence of the pesticide on a tea saucer indicate that the tea served to him was tampered with? Or was this a red herring, a coincidence born of the village's obsession with flora? As Purbright mulled over the possibilities, he observed how the townsfolk continued their subtle dance of conversation and avoidance. The butcher's shop had a new sign boasting locally sourced, while the vicar's sermons grew increasingly pointed about the nature of sin and repentance. The saucer, small and unassuming, was an odd but significant piece of the puzzle. It hinted at the intersection of the ordinary and the lethal, a reminder that in Little Garth, even the most benign object could carry a darker meaning. Purbright made a quiet note to widen his inquiries, to look more closely at those who handled such substances and the grudges they might bear. As twilight deepened, the inspector prepared to expand his circle of interviews, aware that the truth often lurked in the minutiae and the overlooked. The mist lingered like a hesitant secret as Inspector Purbright set out once more into the heart of Little Garth. The village, with its neat hedgerows and orderly lanes, now seemed to him less a picture postcard and more a stage for small dramas simmering just beneath the surface. As Purbright moved from door to door, he encountered characters whose placid facades masked quietly gnawing resentments. There was Mrs. Edith Mallory, the head of the gardening club, whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose allegiance to tradition made her suspicious of newcomers. "Mr. Hawthorne was a pillar of the community," she remarked primly, "but he did have his opinions that didn't always sit well with others, myself included." Then there was Harold Jenkins, the retired schoolmaster, who took an almost paternal interest in village affairs. He mentioned offhandedly, "You see, Inspector, it's the little things that matter, the turning of a phrase, the glance that lingers too long." George could be brusque, yes, but that didn't mean he lacked enemies. Sometimes people are kinder in death than in life. Purbright noted the subtle tensions threading through these conversations. Grudges born of minor slights, alliances formed over garden fences, whispered judgments shared over cups of tea. Each person seemed to guard a piece of the village's tangled history, reluctant to lay it bare but unwilling to forget it. He also took a moment to visit the village apothecary, Mr. Langley, a man whose knowledge of plants and potions was renowned, and whose shop smelled of herbs and secrets. Langley confirmed that a batch of pesticide, the very type Purbright had found traces of, had recently been purchased by an unknown customer who paid in cash and insisted on discretion. "Could be anyone," Langley shrugged. "People prefer to keep some things private, especially when it comes to their gardens." The inspector's mind weighed this carefully. The pesticide could have been a tool or a weapon, or simply a coincidence, but in Little Garth nothing was truly coincidental. As evening settled, Purbright reflected on the growing web of small-town secrets, realizing that this case was less about a single act and more about a community's hidden fractures. The outward calm was a veneer beneath which old grievances and fresh suspicions twined together. The next step, he thought, was to listen more closely to the silences and the unspoken, those subtle clues that spoke volumes. Just as the village had begun to settle into the uneasy rhythms of mourning and speculation, a second incident punctured the fragile calm of Little Garth. It was on a Thursday morning when the mist still clung low over the fields, and the birds sang with an uncharacteristic sharpness, that a discovery was made in the hedgerow bordering the allotments near the village edge. Mrs. Edith Mallory, out for her usual early walk, stumbled upon something that quickly rippled through the community. A torn piece of a letter, soaked and dirt-stained, yet bearing unmistakable handwriting. The letter was addressed to none other than George Hawthorne, and its contents hinted at a dispute far more personal than the public disagreements over housing or gardening. The words, though partially obscured, suggested a falling out with someone close, possibly a family member or intimate friend, threatening exposure or retribution. When Inspector Purbright was called to examine the fragment, his quiet eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The letter's tone was sharp, laced with disappointment and veiled menace, markedly different from the usual civil disputes dominating village affairs. At the same time, a new character emerged from the shadows. Jonathan Eames, George's estranged nephew, who had returned to Little Garth after a decade away in London. Eames was a man whose presence unsettled more than a few villagers. His sharp tongue and brusque manners made him both an outsider and a figure of whispered suspicion. Purbright arranged to meet with Eames at the creaking door. The nephew's alibi was thin. He claimed to have been visiting acquaintances in a neighbouring town on the afternoon of his uncle's death, and his motives, tangled in family discord, were as complicated as the letter suggested. The inspector noted the tension in the room as villagers exchanged glances, some shielding their curiosity behind polite smiles, others unable to disguise their skepticism. This new development shifted the investigation's course, introducing threads of family loyalty, betrayal, and long-buried grievances that deepened the mystery. Purbright, ever patient, knew the road ahead would require peeling back layers of civility to expose the raw truths beneath. As night settled softly over Little Garth, Inspector Purbright retired to the quietude of his study, a modest room lined with books on human nature, local history, and the occasional novel of suspense. Here, far from the prying eyes and whispered speculations of the village, he allowed himself the luxury of reflection. He considered the curious tableau before him. A man dead in a chair, tea served as if life was still clinging to routine. A widow whose composure bordered on the unreadable. A developer whose polished exterior masked ambition and friction. And a nephew whose return stirred more questions than answers. Each character, with their own secret histories and subtle motives, played their part in the intricate dance of village life. Purbright pondered the nature of respectability, the veneer behind which grudges festered, alliances shifted, and resentments quietly simmered. In Little Garth, as in many places, civility was a currency, carefully spent and guarded. Words were measured, actions deliberate, and silence often more telling than confession. He reflected on the behavioral clues gathered so far. The widow's steady hand, the developer's rehearsed alibi, the nephew's evasive glances, and the strange detail of the pesticide-laced saucer. These were not mere facts, but signs. Subtle shifts in tone, timing, and manner that spoke volumes to the patient observer. The inspector's thoughts turned inward as well. He understood that to unravel this mystery would require more than just evidence. It would demand empathy and insight into the frailties and contradictions of human nature. As the clock ticked on, Purbright planned his next move. He would pose a question, polite but pointed, a test to unsettle the guilty and coax the truth from the shadows. The night deepened, carrying with it the promise of revelation. ChatGPT said, the following afternoon, the village hall was once again the setting for a gathering, though this time the mood was noticeably more taut, the air heavy with unspoken anticipation. Purbright had arranged a small meeting under the pretext of a follow-up discussion regarding the Horticultural Society's summer plans, inviting key figures involved in the investigation, Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Stubbs, Miss Clark, Jonathan Eames, and a few others. The seating was deliberately informal, designed to encourage conversation, yet allowing Purbright to observe each participant closely. As the cups of tea were passed around, the inspector's manner was courteous and unhurried, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "There are matters relating to Mr. Hawthorne's passing that require clarification. I hope we can speak candidly. After all, this is a community accustomed to civility and, I trust, honesty." He addressed Mrs. Hawthorne first, noting the faintest tightening around her eyes. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I understand you served Mr. Hawthorne his tea shortly before he passed. May I ask, was the tea prepared in the usual manner?" Her reply was composed, almost rehearsed. "Yes, Inspector, as always." Purbright nodded, then turned to Miss Clark. "You were present in the hall shortly before Mr. Hawthorne was found. Did you observe anything unusual in the minutes leading up to his passing?" Miss Clark hesitated, then admitted, "I did notice that the teapot seemed heavier than usual. I thought perhaps it was just the type of tea Mrs. Hawthorne used." A subtle glance passed between Purbright and Mrs. Hawthorne, whose expression remained inscrutable. Turning next to Mr. Stubbs, Purbright inquired about his whereabouts during the afternoon. Stubbs reaffirmed his alibi with polite confidence, yet his fingers betrayed a slight tremor. Finally, Purbright addressed Jonathan Eames. "Mr. Eames, your recent return to Little Garth has been a topic of much discussion. Might you clarify your movements on the day in question?" Eames's reply was curt but unconvincing. "I was visiting old friends in the next town over, nothing more." The inspector's eyes rested on each in turn. Then, with gentle precision, he posed the pivotal question. "One small detail has troubled me. The saucer found near the tea table bore traces of a pesticide known to be highly toxic. Given Mr. Hawthorne's expertise in gardening, it seems unlikely this would be accidental. Does anyone care to explain how such a substance might have found its way onto the china?" A silence fell. Faces flushed slightly, glances darted furtively. It was a moment pregnant with meaning. Purbright allowed the pause to stretch, watching closely for any sign of discomfort, guilt, or deceit. The question was his test, a polite prod to unsettle the guilty and illuminate the truth. The room remained silent longer than anyone expected. Then, as if releasing a held breath, Mrs. Hawthorne spoke, her voice calm yet edged with a quiet firmness that commanded attention. "Inspector, I have always maintained that George's death was a tragic accident," she began, her eyes meeting Purbright's steadily. "But since this pesticide has been mentioned, perhaps it is time I speak plainly." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "George was a man of routine and principle, but also of secrets. In his garden, he tended to more than just plants. He nurtured old grudges and concealed worries. The pesticide you found was part of a recent experiment he was undertaking to protect his prized dahlias. I did not know at the time that it was so potent." Turning to the others, Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze softened but remained resolute. "On that afternoon, I served him his tea as usual, unaware that a careless mistake had been made. A moment's distraction, a spill of this chemical onto the saucer, and the rest was inevitable." Mr. Stubbs cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "If I may, Mrs. Hawthorne, surely you don't mean to suggest this was deliberate?" "No, Reginald," she replied quietly. "It was not. But sometimes tragedy arises not from malice, but from neglect or circumstance." Jonathan Eames, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "So, you're saying it was an accident? That it wasn't anyone's fault?" Mrs. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Yes. George's death was a terrible misfortune, but not a crime." Inspector Purbright listened, weighing the words carefully. His keen eye noticed the subtle tension lingering beneath the calm explanation, the way Mrs. Hawthorne's fingers trembled ever so slightly, the fleeting glance exchanged between Stubbs and Eames. Yet there was no outburst, no desperate denial. "The evidence, then," Purbright said at last, "points to a tragic accident born of a moment's carelessness. Still, it is the duty of the law to understand every detail, however small." He glanced at each of those present, his tone gentle but firm. George Hawthorne was a man deeply woven into this community's fabric, and his passing will affect us all in ways seen and unseen. As the meeting concluded, the weight of unspoken emotions hung in the air. The village, with all its secrets and stories, had reached a moment of quiet reckoning. Purbright felt the familiar tug of resolution settling over him. Yet he knew that in Little Garth, beneath the surface calm, life's subtle dramas would continue, ever nuanced, ever human. The days following the meeting unfolded with a gentle return to the rhythms of Little Garth. The villagers resumed their routines, the market stalls opened as usual, the church bells chimed Sunday prayers, and the gardens began their slow, steady bloom under the careful watch of Mrs. Mallory and her gardening club. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, subtle shifts had taken root. Mrs. Hawthorne no longer attended the council meetings with the same measured poise. Her eyes held a quiet shadow, as if bearing the weight of grief and unspoken truths. Mr. Stubbs, while maintaining his usual charm, was observed pausing longer than before outside George's now empty cottage, his ambitions tempered by the cost of discord. Inspector Purbright returned to his office, where the scent of old paper and fading ink welcomed him like an old friend. His notebook lay open, filled with observations, half-spoken confessions, and the minutiae of a village's whispered stories. He reflected on the intricate web of human nature he had unravelled, not with spectacle or force, but with patience, quiet insight, and the gentle art of observation. The pivotal truth had lain not in grand accusations, but in the small details, the misplaced saucer, the faint trace of pesticide, the widow's steady hands and rehearsed calm, the careful timing of events. George Hawthorne's death was, as Mrs. Hawthorne had admitted, a tragic accident, an unfortunate spill of poison on a fragile vessel, a moment's distraction that had turned routine tea into a fatal brew. But the story beneath the story was of a village caught between change and tradition, of people bound by years of shared history and petty resentments, striving to maintain civility even as fault lines appeared. As the sun dipped low over Little Garth, casting long shadows over the hedgerows and lanes, Inspector Purbright packed away his notes. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a case closed, not with flourish or fanfare, but with the quiet restoration of order. Stepping out into the cooling air, he paused to glance back at the village, the lives continuing, the secrets kept and revealed, the delicate balance maintained. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled softly, marking the passage of time and the enduring rhythms of human nature. With a slight, knowing smile, Purbright walked on, ready for whatever mystery awaited him next.